wanted to move forward was, where do we start? We've realised this is a huge concern. We understand that it's a big problem and there's a lot to it. So I think there's going to be a lot of people out there and a lot of businesses, and I've been given this task to look at this internally within Dale. And my biggest question is, where do we start? So I think, yeah, that's my burning question.
Yeah, and it's a really good one, because as with everything, when a problem is identified, there's a profit can be made from solving that problem. And absolutely, that's where we want business to go. We want business to be making a profit from solving the problems of the Anthropocene or climate change, or, business in the space. However, what we have is a lot of noise and a lot of not greenwashing per se, but stepping into that realm where organisations will claim to solve your sustainability problems by doing X or Y, and that doesn't necessarily address the problem. That's an off-the-shelf solution that they're giving you that may help in some ways, but our advice is always to look at your business specifically, to do a materiality assessment ideally, which looks at what impact may this have on the business and what do your stakeholders care about. Really, if you think of it on that sort of axis, it's, look, we know that there are changes coming down the line. Let's look across the whole business here and try and understand, not because otherwise, if you're looking at what the impact is on the business and what the impact is to the stakeholders and what they care about. So we're looking at, and if you plot that on a matrix, which is how we do that on a materiality assessment, then you really start to understand where the priorities are. And depending on the size of the business, that piece of work can take a year, to understand. You might want to do some stakeholder analysis, you might want to look at market analysis, you might want to look at where the trends in the market's going, and really understand what policies and changes are going to come down, both from a carrot perspective in terms of the opportunities, as you mentioned, like, our consumers really care about this, or our shareholders now really are starting to care about the carbon reduction plan being in place. They value that. Or we're likely to lose business if we don't have a carbon reduction plan in place, or we're likely to have increased bills if we're continually relying on gas, or if we live in if we work in a heavy water area, industry, we're very likely to have increasing bills coming from that as well. So where are our risks? Some of those you can solve fairly quickly. Some of them, they'll take a bit of understanding and planning, but really that's what we want to do. That honestly can take a long time, or that can be a short conversation where and please do this for somebody that understands sustainable development rather than just one lens of sustainability. So we know, for instance, that carbon is hugely important on the agenda. We know from the IPCC report that we need to reduce our outputs in order to keep that temperature rise at something that is habitable for humans, mammals on the planet. And we know that reducing carbon emissions is a very good way of doing that. Where that is misleading, if you are a business that maybe has a lot of land, is actually, if we lose biodiversity, climate change happens as well. So if we reduce all of our emissions, but we keep losing all of the biodiversity globally, then we're still on that snowball effect of losing it, because temperatures rise from that, and we lose keynote species like whales that we just have never existed on Earth without, and we don't really understand fully the value that they bring. We know that they churn in the same way that worms will churn nitrogen cycle in the soil. We know that whales do that in the ocean, but we don't know how dependent our weather patterns are on those mammals, for instance. So we do know that biodiversity is a hugely important issue. And so when we look at all businesses and we're trying to buy off the shelf the solutions, what we lose is the nuances that apply to our business or our household or our region. And so what we want to do is really look from a bespoke perspective, where are our risks, where are our opportunities, and what are the things that are likely to come down the line from policy or education, really. As our stakeholders become more educated, this isn't always a compliance issue, this becomes a credibility issue. if organisations are claiming to care about the environment and yet they're not caring about their biggest impact, if their biggest impact is biodiversity destruction, for instance, and yet they're singing about how they've reduced their carbon, consumers are becoming very educated and they're very able to point these things out now, and they will see very clearly the discrepancy in the celebration of carbon, for instance, and they'll say, well, okay, so you've reduced your carbon, but the main point of your business is, you know, if you're an oil company, for instance, the main part of your business is creating carbon. So the fact that you've reduced your carbon here, your business is still a destructive business. So we need to be careful how we, from not just from a consumer perspective, but also from our own business perspective, we need to be careful that we look at it through the holistic spectrum of sustainability. Some of it won't matter, some of it will be really interesting. I tend to find with organisations that when we go through that process, there'll be things that they care about that they hadn't realised they can bring into the business. And company culture, those sorts of things become really important in this transition as you're trying to bring everybody along with you. So finding commonalities is really important as well.
Obviously, you said best place to start is a materiality assessment, and obviously understanding where you obviously emit most or you have the most impact. I suppose once that's been ascertained to a certain degree, what are the following steps that then need to be taken, I guess?
Yeah, well, after you've undertaken a materiality assessment, which is assessing, you know, what matters to your business or what's going to impact your business and what matters and will impact your stakeholders, and you then prioritize those. And if you've undertaken surveys or market research that you can actually plot those on a graph, that is made obvious for you, but not all organisations will have the resources to do that. So what you then start to look at, you know, where are our priorities within this? And you really want to break them down. It's not just carbon, you know, you want to break them down into much smaller chunks. And then you prioritise both in terms of low-hanging fruit, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with going with low-hanging fruit. It gets you absolutely further along the line, and what we don't want is feeling stagnant because you're not achieving anything. So we want organisations to swap out light bulbs, 100% do that, because it makes you change your carbon footprint and it makes you feel good about the achievements that you're able to make. So we definitely want that. Do we want you to challenge other people in the office to cycle to work once a week? 100%. These things might not look huge, but they bring about a community atmosphere of change, and that gets people on board, which then leads to a snowball effect. So absolutely looking at the low-hanging fruit and doing those things is brilliant. But really you want to then prioritise, and the most important point after that is to take some baseline data. So look at, okay, so before we can manage anything, we need to measure it. And so we need to take some real understanding of our carbon footprint this year, last year, 3 years before. Obviously, COVID has had an impact on a lot of that. So we can't celebrate that if we're not using that as an opportunity to change our behaviour. And what you don't want is resting on your laurels and saying, oh, we reduced our carbon in 2020 by 30% as an organisation, and then that skyrockets up in 2022, 2023, because you haven't achieved something. In actual fact, you've benefited from a lockdown, or you've celebrated benefiting from a lockdown and not used that as a learning opportunity. So we need to take a baseline, figure out where the biggest problems are and how we can reduce them, and pick off the low-hanging fruit, and then look at the most complex ones and set out a roadmap of how you can start to make changes on the ones that are least easy or least obvious.